Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the History Challenge. Today, we are really blessed to have Jim Zwerg, an early civil rights icon who was one of the first white allies in the movement. Not one of the first, but one of the few white allies in the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. He was a member of the Nashville student movement, and in 1961 was one of the first freedom riders to take a bus into the South to make sure that the federal government was honoring the desegregation of interstate bus movement. His seatmates on the Freedom Ride were Paul Brooks and later John Lewis, who later grew to fame and is currently still a congressman from the state of Georgia. Welcome, Mr. Zwerg.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Glad to be with you.
To what extent your community shared the values that you exhibited later in your life, and to what extent you got your values from your family, your mother, your father, your sibling. So can you compare and contrast the community you lived in with your family and how that shaped your civil rights views?
Appleton, Wisconsin, when I was growing up in the 40s and 50s, was a lily white community. We had some Indian reservations nearby, but none of the Native American students came into Appleton to our schools. The only interaction I had with persons of color was through my scouting. I was very active in both Cub and scouting, Boy Scouting and Explorer Scouting. I'm an Eagle Scout, served on camp staffs, and frequently in camp situations would interact with kids from mainly Milwaukee and Madison who were African American. Once in a while, an Asian, but rare. As far as it goes, obviously my scouting impacted me. I believed in Scout Oath and Law. However, my basic view of the world, of interactions with people, was ingrained in me by my parents. My dad was a dentist, my mother was an English teacher. I was raised on a lot of the classic books, loved them, Moby Dick, Robinson Crusoe, those types of things. We were very active in our church and went to Sunday school from being a little kid, turned into an acolyte as I got older, sang in youth choirs and the adult choir as I got older. We had a youth minister. It was a fairly large church. We were over 1,000 people. My senior year, I was elected the president of the youth group. We had like 65, 70 kids in the group. And there again, at church camp, for instance, they were all white kids. We didn't have any minority kids at church camp. But in Appleton, I mean, you didn't hear, we didn't have TV. You know, we barely got TV started when I was about to graduate in '58. You didn't have cell phones. And you did have the news that you could listen to on the radio. And if you happened to be in the movie theaters on the weekends or during the week, they would always have the newsreel section. The local newspapers covered local information. Very rarely, once in a while, the Milwaukee Journal would have something, going on about the South or Dr. King, but you just didn't hear about what was happening in the South. I was totally ignorant, I'll say. It wasn't until I got to college, which was a Beloit College, which bordered the Illinois-Wisconsin state border, small liberal arts college, where I had a African-American roommate, one of my roommates. And that afforded me, maybe I'm not sure if opportunity is the right word, but to witness firsthand the prejudice and abuse that he took in Beloit. I had pledged a fraternity. I figured that was the thing to do, and I was all excited and went to invite him over to the house, and then was informed in no uncertain terms he was not welcome because the fraternity was segregated. I gave them back their pledge pin. That was Sigma Chi, the sweetheart of Sigma Chi, if you can believe. That's where I started seeing something that I didn't like. And Bob never responded either verbally or physically to the abuse he took. And that bothered me. I had a very short temper. And I felt he should do something. And I approached him on it and said, you know, Bob, why do you just sit there and take it? And he went to his dresser and pulled out a copy of Dr. King's Stride Towards Freedom, the story of the Montgomery bus boycott. He said, read this, and then we'll talk about it. So I did. And in it, Dr. King lays out the 6 principles of nonviolence and the 6 steps to bring about social change. As I read them, you know, they were interesting, and I saw some similarities between the principles of nonviolence and what I'd learned in Sunday school in the Gospels. But I just, it didn't hit me that this was something relevant to me. I mean, I saw it work. It was successful in Montgomery. And as we talked with Bob, he just said, you know, I see this and I would rather take the high road and not respond in kind. But it got me thinking about, I wonder how I would react if I was in his shoes. The possibility of going to Fisk took over, and I applied, and I was accepted to go to Fisk my second semester, my junior year. And that's what led me to the South. And again, I didn't go with any indication, any thought really of getting involved in the civil rights movement. My main thoughts were, how am I going to be treated? How am I going to respond?
That leads us perfectly into the second question, which is, and you can respond to those 2 ideas, because I would love to hear how are you going to be treated and how are you going to respond. But let's talk a little bit about how are you going to be treated. Was there a sense immediately that you were an outsider? How many white students were there at Fisk? How long did it take for you to integrate? But in all of that idea is, did you feel immediately accepted, or did it take a while? Did it take for you to become involved in the civil rights movement for you to feel that kinship?
I arrived the day before most of the students returned to campus. So I went to my dorm room. My roommate wasn't there. Went over to the student union to grab something to eat. As I recall, I got a milkshake and a hamburger and some fries. And as I turned around, a young couple of students invited me to join them in their booth. So I was basically welcomed right off the bat. And, we introduced ourselves. Ultimately, there were 10 exchange students. In addition to myself, 2 women, two of the women students, became actively involved. We were having such a good time. I thought, it's early in the afternoon. Why don't we go down and take in a movie together? And these 2 looked at me, and he said, Jim, we can't go to the movies together. The movie theaters are segregated. Not only can we not sit together, we can't go to the same snack bar, and we can't even use the same restroom. My reaction to that was, you've got to be kidding me. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I hadn't realized it until that point, but they said, that's true. And in fact, we're going to be starting a campaign to integrate the movie theaters. And when they said we, they had been involved in the sit-ins the year before that opened up several of the department stores. And in mentioning this, they said that there was going to be a meeting that evening. I mean, this is my first day on campus. And that there was going to be this meeting, and invited me to go to it. So that evening, a number of the students, those students that had arrived back at Fisk, who had participated in this previous year, were there for that meeting to discuss plans for the upcoming campaign. Now, Fisk was not the only student. There were like there were like 6 different schools that had students participating in the movement. But I learned that there was going to be a demonstration the following Saturday, and in the downtown main strip, there were 4 movie theaters in 4 separate blocks. And they were going to demonstrate at each one. They told me what bus I could take to go down and watch. And for a first round, it didn't accomplish very much. But I went over after about a half an hour and went up to the back of the line and introduced myself and explained what I'd been doing, and asked what their objective had been that day, because it didn't seem that much was happening. Well, I was referred to their spokesman. Every demonstration, there was a spokesman at each one of those movie theaters who was kind of the leader. And they were members of what was called the Central Committee in Nashville. That was a group of about 24 students from the various schools that had shown themselves through experience to remain nonviolent no matter what happened, and showing leadership. They were selected by the students to represent the various schools. And as I went forward and met this spokesman, that spokesman happened to be John Lewis. And he mentioned that the demonstration was going to be ending. They'd be returning to the church where they met. And if I wanted to talk further, I could follow them. So I did. And literally, again, within the first week, I had the opportunity to meet several of the youth leaders in Nashville and meet with John, who invited me to an upcoming workshop on nonviolence, where Jim Lawson was the instructor. Jim was a Methodist minister who had been thrown out of Vanderbilt Theological Seminary for his anti-war demonstrations. He'd spent a year and a half in prison, and he had worked with Dr. King, was very knowledgeable about Kingian nonviolence, but he also had gone and spent 4 years over in India in the Gandhi Institute. So he brought, and King had asked him, he saw the potential in the students of Nashville, and he asked Jim to come to Nashville to train the students in nonviolence. A workshop was really kind of 2 parts. One part was almost like a religious service. One of the first things that I got involved with was a newsletter called Voice of the Movement. And that since we had so many different schools involved, we wanted some kind of a communication device that would let the students know not only what was upcoming in the way of demonstrations or workshops or whatever, but what had also taken place. Then the second half of the workshops was real tough role playing. If a student wanted to, felt they wanted to demonstrate, they had to make it through these very intense role-playing situations. They'd set it up like you're going to be in a demonstration. And especially the students that were of the central committee, but others would come out and act as those against it, the mob, whatever you want to call them, the hecklers. And they would use every profanity. They would spit on you. They would blow smoke in your face. They'd threaten to put a cigarette out on your neck. They'd kick you, hit you. And if you broke, you weren't going to demonstrate. So nobody was turned away. But if you couldn't control your emotions, you weren't going to demonstrate. And this was not something that, you did it once and said, okay, you can demonstrate. Because ultimately, I took that role of a heckler, and I used to say my mom would have washed out my mouth with soap, some of the things I said to my friends. Ultimately, I started really wrestling with nonviolence as a way of life. As I did, I said, I want to, don't think I'm going to demonstrate, but I want to just see what it's like. So when it first started and we were just standing in line, the things that were said to me, okay, they weren't very nice. But one of my friends, a young woman, was standing in front of me, and one fella started making suggestive comments about the two of us in our relationship. And that bugged me. I sort of clenched my fists and put my lip, but I didn't say anything, and I didn't lash out. And when it was over, I felt so good. I didn't believe I could do that. It came to the point where I said, yes, this makes sense to me. I embrace nonviolence as my way of life. It's so much the Christian message. It just hit me. And then, given that I had not broken, I kind of approached and was approached to take part in a demonstration. I was the first white student to do that year. And of course, having a white student participate provided some really neat things, because I could go up and get 2 tickets. They didn't know me. As the students were coming, I'd go ahead and I'd get the 2 tickets. And as they arrived, I had one to Bill. And the very first night, the doors going in weren't locked to the lobby, but the manager did have a couple toughs in there. We made it into the lobby, and wham bam, both of us were knocked cold and dragged out of the sidewalk. I don't know what they hit us with, but the kids said they were monkey wrenches that saw it through the doors. So that was my introduction in my very first demonstration. So that's where I saw kind of my role, that I could provide something to the movement that they couldn't do, and did that. Became very active in the demonstrations at the movie theaters, and actually it wasn't too long after that where I was asked to be a member of the Central Committee, where I was then helping put together the workshops on nonviolent or those in the community. Ultimately, I was asked to work with the attorneys in negotiating the integration of the movie theaters. So, you know, I was very active.
Wow. I also mentioned to anyone watching that Jim has given us great insight into the early part of his involvement in the civil rights movement in Nashville. But if you want to see more about the pivotal freedom rides, please watch the 2010 documentary Freedom Rides by PBS, and there is definitely a great interview with Jim in that. We're not going to necessarily talk about that right now because I think that really that video encapsulates everything that you think was important. But I do want to bring up this idea, and I'm going to actually switch things up a little bit. I'm going to go to the challenge question right now, and then we'll end talking about the last two, because I think what I've heard you talk about this whole time, as I'm listening to it, it's really interesting how, and I guess this is logical, but how you grew from adolescence, and you took in all of these things that made you who you were, whether it was Eagle Scout, whether it was being a member of your church, whether it was having Bob Carter as your roommate, but all of these things built on one another and allowed you to
Yes.
put your beliefs to the ultimate test, which was to really put your life on the line. My challenge question to you is, with all of that action came the reaction. Last year you shared with me, and I don't know if you can see this all that well, but you shared with
the
me
hate letter.
A letter that you
The hate letter, yes. Is that a classic or what?
It's a classic. It's up in my classroom. And I want to ask you, the challenge question I have is, how did you feel when you got it? And then I think I know how you feel about it now, but did the feeling change over time, or have you had the same attitude to this letter from the minute you got it? And if you can talk about some of the amazing ironies in the letter that you shared with me last year, that would be great if you could share it with students. So
understand that I spent 5 days in the hospital there in Montgomery, and my picture and John's picture of our having been beaten literally went around the world. So during those 5 days, if you will, my parents were inundated with letters. The vast majority of them were positive, reinforcing what I'd done, praising what I'd done, congratulating them on raising such a neat kid, even though they weren't very happy that I'd done it. When I got home, there were literally boxes full of letters. Very few hate letters, but they got a few, and they got some calls. But remember, my mom was an English teacher, and I think she's the one that kind of saw the uniqueness of that letter. I don't recall if she's the one that handed it to me or what, but I have to say, yeah, the very first time I read it, I mean, this guy hated everybody. I was a foreigner because I had the name Zwerg. I was so lucky to be in this United States, you know, and Jews were bad, and he belittled the girls, the women involved in the movement, because he figured they were just looking for husbands. I mean, it was just, you read it. It's. I have to say, it's all typewritten, single space, 4 or 5 letters, 5 pages as I recall. And he ends it with, you know, loosen up and fly right, kind of a thing. I don't think the gentleman was very well educated. Um, but I I have shared it with most all my brothers and sisters simply because it is such a classic. Being from the Dixie Hotel in New York City, um, I mean, it's just everything about it was just so special and unique.
He also mentions in there, not only are you foreign, but you are no doubt, quote, possessed with communistic ideas, or you wouldn't be going to all
Oh yeah,
create these disturbances throughout the Southland. So
being called a communist frequently.
all of your experiences had such a deep impact on you that they led you to be involved in the movement. But then after the movement is over, those belief systems didn't end. I know you've shared with me once, it's not like you've given up or stopped the ideas of nonviolence. You've lived them your entire life. So I'm wondering how those experiences outside of the civil rights movement displayed themselves in your life. What did you do post 1961 with all of this knowledge, with all of this experience, and how does that lead to your final advice for our students?
First thing that impacted me after I got home was the reality of how far away I was from my brothers and sisters in the movement, and how literally no one around me could truly share that experience. That was hard. Um, that's why I felt it's so important that I explain to my parents um, that this was an extension of my faith, that they were the ones that instilled in me. And that was a very uncomfortable situation because my dad absolutely refused to discuss it. I could talk a little bit with my mom. I was being asked to speak by various groups over the summer. And even after I got back down to Beloit, I did a lot of speaking. But there was a psychological impact, I'll say, that hit. That part of it was, I'm by myself. I'm not back down there with other students who were part of it and understand it and share it. I can talk to them occasionally on the phone, but even there, we didn't have cell phones then. It was very, very difficult to communicate with them. And between that and the situation at home, when I had tried to call them the night before we got on the bus, to tell them how much I love them and to thank them for giving me the love and the ethic, if you will, to live my faith. And to be told, just, you can't go, you're killing your father. And my mother finally hanging up on me with the words, "You've killed your father." I had never been so certain in my life that getting on that bus was God's will for me. Never. It was never a question. And I had hoped that my parents would respond like parents do when they send their kids off to boot camp. You'll be careful, honey. We love you. Take care of yourself. That didn't happen. And so I built up within me anger at that. These were the people that taught me, brought me up, and they're saying, no, what you did was wrong. Not just that I didn't obey my parents, what I did was wrong, that I'd been brainwashed. The most important spiritual moment of my life on that bus platform. And they didn't accept it. So there was anger, but there was also guilt because my dad did have a heart attack and my mom had a breakdown. So inside of me was going all this churning, and I turned to booze. I started drinking. My senior year, the summer after I graduated, I decided I needed to get away, and through our church, our denomination, I spent the summer on the Rosebud Reservation. And it was a good change of pace, if you will. It was amazing to see the Native Americans, how totally docile and almost hopeless they live their lives after being with such a militant, if you will, group of those that were going to change things. Didn't exist on the reservation. Some of the places were so poor. I didn't drink out there. That was a good experience. And during that senior year, before I graduated in September, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference held their meeting in Nashville, and the 10 of us that continued the ride were awarded Dr. King's, well, his organization's Award of Merit, whatever you want to call it. So the 10 of us were reunited down in Nashville for that. And the wonderful thing was I had an opportunity to spend about a half an hour one-on-one with Dr. King. And he asked me how I was doing, and I was able to share all this with him. And this was when Freedom Summer was in the plans for the following year when I went to the reservation instead. I had been approached to take part in Freedom Summer. With the condition situation at home, I was seriously thinking of maybe just quitting school and getting involved in the movement, giving my life to the movement, if you will. But as I spoke with Dr. King, I told him that this also had kind of brought to a head in my mind that the possibility of entering the ministry. That I felt the message of nonviolence just really dovetailed the Christian message and needed to be shared. And he encouraged me to pursue my going into the ministry and helped me make that decision, if you will. Coming up on Thanksgiving, and for some reason I felt I'm going to give it one more shot to try and talk to my dad. At first, I wasn't going to go home, and she had invited me to her home for Thanksgiving. And I treated her terribly. I stood her up. I went to Appleton. I tried to broach the subject with my dad, and he just blew up. So I got back in the car and drove back down to seminary and spent Thanksgiving getting drunk in my dorm room. It was a long time over a lot of years that we ultimately reconciled in that part.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know that Carrie and your family have played such an important role in your life. And even when you just mentioned that's where I met my wife, Carrie, your face, every time I talk to you, your face lights up when you say her name. So that's just outstanding. So just one final thing, Jim.
In my life.
One final
Sure.
thing is you look right into that camera and you tell if you encapsulate everything down to one, I know it's hard to do, but to one kernel of ultimate truth, what would you share with people who would watch this?
Love is always stronger than hate. Forgiveness is one of the most powerful forces in the world. And you can make a difference individually. Go do it.
Thank you, Jim Zwerg. Always inspirational to me. You know, how there were important people in your life, whether it was your parents, Bob Carter, Dr. King. You always inspire me to try to do better, even at 51. So I can't imagine what effect hearing this will have on the young people who watch it, but just know that you make a powerful difference to not just young, but older people as well. So I thank you for taking the time, and we'll continue our chats.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much.
Take care.